Both countries are facing pressure from the same source. This week, Donald Trump's administration imposed a 50% tariff on India's exports, adding significant strain on its economy. At the same time, Ottawa appointed a new ambassador to New Delhi, a move seen as an important step toward easing tensions after Canadian officials had previously accused the Indian government of involvement in assassinations and extortion on Canadian soil. On the surface, the two events may appear unrelated, but in reality they are closely connected within a shared strategy. Confronted with pressure from Washington, both Canada and India have strong incentives to seek each other out, find common ground.
The right tool for this current moment.
What we're doing, again, is matching what the U.S. is doing. That's fair. It's fair to match what they've done. And it puts us in a better position to focus in on exactly those sectors work forward. So sometimes, to go back to the earlier question, you drop the gloves in the first period. When you're late in the game, dropping the gloves and taking the extra penalty might not be the best thing to do.
As trade tensions continue with the U.S., what could this mean for negotiations between the two countries? James Moore is a former conservative industry minister, and he joins me now. Hey, James, thanks for coming on.
Pleasure's mine.
How would you characterize what the Prime Minister has done here with the retaliatory tariffs? Is it a form of capitulation, a betrayal, or do you see it as an act of goodwill to try and get a deal done?
I think it's appropriate for the moment, but there's a piece of his analogy that is unknown. He says that there are times in a hockey game where you do want to go into the corners, elbows up, and maybe drop the gloves, and there's times to be more disciplined and finesse things. But at the end of the analogy that he just played right there is he said, when you're heading towards the end of a game and it's very close, maybe you don't want to take a penalty. So the question is, are we towards the end of the game?
The timing of all this truly speaks volumes. To understand why it carries such weight, one must look at the scale of what Donald Trump has just done. The imposition of a 50% tariff on Indian goods is not merely a number. It is a heavy blow to trade flows worth billions of dollars, while also shaking the very foundation of Washington-New Delhi relations. Until recently, the United States remained India's largest trading partner, with a total annual exchange of $212 billion. Now, that relationship is visibly fracturing, and it is precisely at this moment that the name Mark Carney steps onto the stage. Carney, the Canadian economist and politician, took office in 2025 as the country's 24th Prime Minister. He had previously served as Governor of the Bank of Canada from 2008 to 2013, and then as Governor of the Bank of England from 2013 to 2020. Clearly, Carney is not the typical politician who merely maneuvers within the confines of trade wars. He is among the few with deep expertise in the workings of global financial markets. His approach to the Canada-US trade conflict is deliberate and calculated. Carney once used a down-to-earth hockey analogy. Sometimes you need to know when to jump into the fight, and when to stay disciplined in order to secure long-term victory.
Dropping the gloves and taking the extra penalty might not be the best thing to do.
Prime Minister Mark Carney's decision to lift most of the retaliatory tariffs on American goods is not an act of concession. It is a strategic move designed to keep the door to dialogue wide open as long as Washington remains willing to engage. Throughout the negotiations with the United States, the Canadian government has remained steadfast in defending jobs and the interests of domestic businesses. We will continue along that path as we search for a long-term solution. Yet the reality is that the Trump administration still imposes heavy tariffs on Canada. This has produced a consequence Trump did not anticipate, a major diplomatic turning point. Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand has announced that Christopher Cooter will be appointed as Canada's new High Commissioner to New Delhi, ending a vacancy of nearly a year after both Ottawa and New Delhi expelled each other's senior diplomats. This decision illustrates how tariff pressure has generated fresh momentum for the two countries to reopen channels of communication. The reason Canada-India relations had reached an impasse was not trade, but something far more serious. The Canadian government had publicly accused Indian agencies of being linked to killings and extortion on our soil, allegations that cannot simply be brushed aside. However, with the economy under threat from a 50% tariff imposed by a key trading partner, both sides are now compelled to reconsider what their vital priorities must be. India is not standing idle either. New Delhi has appointed Dinesh Patnaik, currently ambassador to Spain, as its new High Commissioner to Ottawa. Clearly, both sides are seeking ways to untangle their diplomatic deadlock in order to focus on economic interests. As Prime Minister Carney has stressed, Canada must strengthen and expand its trade relationships worldwide. This is not just a diplomatic gesture, it is an unavoidable reality. The supply chain system that Canada and the United States have built together over decades is deeply intertwined and cannot be easily separated. That is why diversifying partnerships with countries such as India will be a strategic step for the future.
The difference with Canada is that those are precisely the sectors in which our economies are the most integrated. So if it's the automobile tariffs, the aluminum tariffs, softwood lumber is another example. For decades, we have integrated supply chains, just-in-time delivery. I've said before, Canada and the United States don't as much sell things to each other, but build things together and sell them around the world. We've taken very, very tough measures, as has the United States, with respect to dumping from countries like China of steel and aluminum. So we're optimistic that we can continue to have those conversations with President Trump's administration and make the case that there's an economic opportunity for both countries if we reset some of those sectoral tariffs.
Even so, the trade barriers imposed by Mr. Trump are forcing circumstances to shift. The Section 232 tariffs on steel, aluminum, and copper have dealt a heavy blow to Canadian businesses, with direct consequences for jobs as well as investment decisions across many regions of the country.
What Prime Minister Carney released late last week on Friday, they were very specific in this news release, in this press release, that said, look, when you look at the sort of reframing of trade with America, countries around the world, our competitors in trade, are paying 15% up to 50% in some cases in terms of broad-based tariffs. But when we look at Canadian access to the the American market through CUSMA, about 85 to 90% of the products we sell them are going through tariff-free. But as you've mentioned, it's those areas like steel, aluminum, copper, auto parts. Those are what we call 232 tariffs. Those are the ones that are still having a really significant tariff put on them. And that's damaging to Canadian business, certainly. Our membership is feeling it at the Canadian Chamber, and we're seeing that affect jobs, affect investment decisions, and other things like that that are so critical for business. So they are damaging, but what this move does is it just to say, look, we're here with goodwill, we're negotiating with you, we're meeting you on the things we can agree on, but it's the other things like steel and aluminum that we need to focus the next step on. And that's where we see some sign of hope here, is that Canada is signaling, look, we're willing to be good partners here, but let's get to business on the parts that we can agree on, and that's steel, aluminum, copper.
When one door closes, it is only natural to find a way to open another. And when the United States is no longer a reliable partner, the only option is diversification. For India, however, this shock is far more severe. Economists warn that the new tariffs could devastate India's key export industries, pushing hundreds of thousands of workers into unemployment. The gemstone, diamond, shrimp export, ready-made garment, and carpet manufacturing sectors, heavily dependent on American customers, are taking heavy losses. What is being lost here is not just reflected in statistics, but in the very real families stripped of their livelihoods because of a trade war sparked by Trump. From textile mills to seafood processing plants, the risk of job losses is spreading everywhere, traders say. Yet this very factor makes the geopolitical picture all the more striking. Both Canada and India are being forced to pivot away from the US market, something almost unimaginable just months ago. At home, many Canadian businesses have delayed investment plans due to uncertainty, but at the same time, they have also begun seeking customers in new regions and expanding domestic trade to reduce dependency.
Yeah, so look, I think we've been going through this for the past 8 cases, have held off on making decisions, whether it be on investing in capital, investing in people, investing in their businesses, until they can get a little bit more understanding what this looks like. When you look at the broader numbers overall from a Canadian perspective as well, Manitoba obviously included in that, what we have seen is a decrease in exports to the United States. Typically in the past, we were somewhere in the neighborhood about 73-74%. I saw some May numbers that showed us about...
This stunning exchange, economist Jeffrey Sachs lays bare India's ultimate dilemma. While passionately advocating for India to take its rightful place on the world stage, a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, the Indian host is forced to admit the inconvenient truth. It's China that's blocking the door. In that moment, India's ambition collides head-on with its geopolitical predicament. Sachs's response is not what you'd expect. Instead of siding with the US-led narrative, he offers India a piece of brutally honest, almost unthinkable advice on how to deal with Beijing. This isn't just a discussion, it's a public dissection of India's strategic paralysis and a challenge to the very foundation of its foreign policy. What he says next could redefine the future of Asia.
In February, you quoted Henry Kissinger at the European Parliament, and you said, "To be an enemy of the United States is dangerous, but to be a friend is fatal." Would you offer the same advice to policymakers in India as they try to navigate the Trump tariffs?
That line is actually Henry Kissinger's famous line, that if you're a friend of the United States, beware. Very dangerous. I have lived a whole lifetime of America declaring its friendship to countries that end up getting destroyed, in part because of that wonderful friendship. I don't think I have to give advice to India. It's a little superfluous. But just be careful, you know? There is no alliance there. India is anyway too big for alliances. You are an alliance in and of yourself. Civilizations behave as civilizations do. And so being the most populous country in the world, you take care in your relations everywhere. But I would say the idea
about the UN Security Council, there are 5 permanent members, and the one blocking India's entry happens to be China. So when you talk about India working with China, and India has put the best foot forward every time, so there are issues to be resolved there. But
just to say, yes. I talk to Chinese politicians and diplomats all the time, and I'm always telling them, admit India as the 6th permanent member.
Yes.
Because it's good for China and it's good for India. It's good for the whole world. And I'm also explaining it's good for China because we need a multipolar world. We're way past the United States leading anything, okay? We want it to be there and be cooperative. Don't make a mess. Be nice. Play with the others, okay? To have that kind of world, India needs to be there, right front and center. And China wants that, so China's not just facing American bashing all the time. So, to my view, what I say to the Chinese diplomats all the time is welcome India into the permanency at the Security Council for your own good as well as the good of the world.
Well, what can I say? I just hope they listen to your very sound advice.
But it is very much on my mind because the entire U.S. foreign policy is divide and conquer in any part of the world. That's how empires behave. That's what the U.S. learned from the master empire of all, the British. We learned at their knee, and we still try to apply it. So the U.S. loves for India to be in the Quad. It wants India to bash China. I heard some Indian politicians recently saying, no, it's not Donald Trump's trade policy. It's all because of China. No, not exactly. It's actually because of Donald Trump. So just be careful not to play the game. This is really a U.S. game. India's too big for a U.S. game.
The advice is well taken. Maybe India also wants to beat up China, but on its own terms. Let's talk about India. You've praised India's economic growth in the past, which has happened, and India thrived thanks to globalization. Do you believe that globalization can survive this protectionist turn that Washington has taken?
First of all, India is doing wonderfully, and it doesn't surprise me because I've watched India in its takeoff, and I've been privileged to be coming to India now for 46 years, so I've watched a lot of India's remarkable achievement. I'll tell you, it's an old story, but for me, it's a very vivid story. When I first came to India with my girlfriend, who's now my wife of 45 years, I carried a book in my backpack by Gunnar Myrdal called The Asian Drama. He was the Nobel Swedish laureate who wrote about Asia. And of course, he was the one that said India could never achieve economic growth, that it was doomed to what was euphemistically called the Hindu growth rate of 2% per year. And this was my first book as I roamed India for a month in 1979, trying to understand this. Of course, I never believed this, and I never believed that any country is somehow condemned to poverty or doomed to backwardness. It's the opposite of what real economics shows. We are in an age of convergence right now. We're in an age where countries are catching up for lost time. India, as you know, was the second or the first largest economy in the world forever, for hundreds and hundreds of years, until, if I could say, the British arrived and did their job for quite a while. I do have a theory in life that all of today's challenges at the core have a British story to them, whether it's the Middle East or whether it's some other place, whether it's China too, because the British showed up in 1839 to demand the right to export opium to China, the opposite of the fentanyl emergency and so forth. In any event, India and China fell far behind, and they fell far behind until independence. And independence enabled catching up. And both started a rapid catching up. the idea of sustainable development as their framework. And 6 weeks later, all 193 UN member states adopted the Paris Climate Agreement, recognizing that it's no joke. We really have an environmental emergency, whether we like it or not. That consensus is very fragile, though, because my country, the United States, doesn't spend too much time thinking about it.
To be an enemy of the United States is dangerous, but to be a friend is fatal. Sachs wasn't just quoting history. He was applying it directly to India's present, arguing that America's friendship comes with a price, being used as a pawn to beat up China. He effectively told India, you are not a partner in their eyes. You are a tool. Second, he exposed the hypocrisy at the heart of the rules-based international order. He revealed how the United States, his own country, voted against a UN resolution for peaceful coexistence simply because the phrase was associated with China. This isn't geopolitics, Sachs implies. It's petty, dangerous, and driven by a neurotic obsession with being number one forever. And perhaps most importantly for the host nation, he highlighted India's greatest strategic paradox. He champions India's rise, calling for its permanent seat at the UN Security Council, only to be reminded by the host that its path is blocked by China. It's a moment of raw honesty, where India's global aspirations meet the wall of regional rivalry. But Sachs's proposed solution is where this conversation truly enters radical territory. He doesn't offer the standard American prescription of forming alliances to contain China. Instead, he tells India to do the exact opposite. Get friendly with China, build trust, and convince them that a multipolar world, with India as a permanent Security Council member, is in everyone's best interest, including Beijing's. This is the Sachs doctrine in action. It's a call to transcend the zero-sum game of empires, a game he argues America learned from the British and continues to play through strategies like the Quad. He sees a world where major civilizations like India and China, which together represent 40% of humanity, should be shaping the future, not being pitted against each other by a declining hegemon. The question left hanging in the air is a monumental one. Is this vision naively idealistic, or is it the only sane path forward in a world teetering on the brink of multiple conflicts? Sachs is betting that cooperation, based on the shared goals of sustainable development, is the only way to avoid a catastrophic clash of titans. From the trade wars with Europe to the proxy war in Ukraine and the simmering tensions over Taiwan, Sachs paints a picture of an America ruled by impulse rather than strategy, a one-man show that has made the world a more dangerous place. And in this volatile new era, his message to rising powers like India is clear: your greatest strength is your independence. Don't trade it for...
Instead, America often treated India with suspicion. Think about the 1971 Bangladesh Liberation War. India stepped in to stop one of the worst humanitarian crises in South Asia, to defend millions of refugees pouring across its borders, to stand against atrocities. But what did the United States do? It sided with Pakistan. Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, names etched in India's memory, chose to send the 7th Fleet into the Bay of Bengal, not in support of India's humanitarian effort, but to intimidate it. That single act burned into India's psyche the reality that America's strategic interests would always outweigh morality, and that memory never went away. Even when India and the US began warming ties in the 1990s and 2000s, every handshake was accompanied by a shadow whispering, remember 1971, remember who they stood with. Then came the sanctions. After India's nuclear tests in 1998, India, surrounded by hostile neighbors, made the sovereign decision to test its nuclear capability. But America responded with harsh sanctions, treating India almost like an enemy. Contrast that with Pakistan, decades of military aid, billions of dollars funneled, despite its well-known role in terrorism. What message did that send to India? That Washington's loyalty was transactional, not principled. That America's definition of a friend was someone who served its immediate strategic needs, not someone who shared its democratic values. But you might be thinking, well, hasn't the relationship improved since then? Yes, on the surface, the US-India nuclear deal under George W. Bush was a landmark. Defense cooperation grew, trade soared, and in the last decade, especially with the rise of China, America began wooing India like never before, inviting it into strategic frameworks like the Quad, praising it as a counterweight to Beijing. But here's the problem. Indians are not naive. They can see when they're being courted, not out of genuine respect, but out of geopolitical desperation. They can see when Washington's smiles are less about friendship and more about fear of losing power in Asia. And then came the recent cracks, the moments that pulled the curtain back on the performance. Let's talk about the weaponization of values. How many times has Washington preached to India about democracy, human rights, and freedom of speech? Every time America feels uneasy about India's domestic policies, it holds up the moral mirror. Yet when it comes to its own allies, the mirror disappears. Saudi Arabia, billions in weapon sales despite thorough democratic freedoms. Pakistan, endless indulgence despite harboring terrorists. And yet India, the largest democracy on earth, faces lectures. The hypocrisy isn't just noticed in New Delhi. It's felt in the hearts of ordinary Indians who ask, why does America treat us like a student to be scolded, not a partner to be respected? And then came the allegations, the whispers, the accusations that India was involved in plots on foreign soil. Washington didn't hesitate to make these public, to embarrass India on the global stage rather than resolve them quietly as genuine partners would. For many Indians, this was the breaking point. Because when you accuse a sovereign nation of something so grave, and you do it in the court of global opinion, instead of trusted diplomatic channels, you're not treating them as an ally, you're treating them as a suspect. And that, my friends, is not how trust works. So let's pause and ask the question. If America could betray India in the past, lecture it in the present, and expose it in the global arena when it suited their narrative, why should India ever believe that tomorrow will be any different? Trust is not built on convenience. It is built on consistency. And America's record with India has been anything but consistent. But it's not just about history or diplomacy, it's about psychology. Nations, just like individuals, have memories. And India's memory is long. It remembers colonial exploitation, it remembers Cold War duplicity, it remembers sanctions, it remembers being sidelined in global institutions, and now it remembers being humiliated under the guise of partnership. This is why when Washington extends its hand today, India doesn't see a partner, it sees a puppeteer, and India has no intention of dancing to anyone's strings again. Now here's where it gets even more interesting, because the story isn't just about the past, it's about the future. And in that future, India has options. Once upon a time, nations like India had no choice but to lean on American power. But today, the world is multipolar. India can buy oil from Russia despite Western sanctions. It can trade with the Middle East and Africa without needing Washington's blessing. It can strengthen ties with Europe, Japan, ASEAN. It can leverage its billion-plus population to attract global investment on its own terms. In other words, India doesn't need America in the way Washington wants to believe it does. And that, my friends, is why the vase of trust lies shattered on the ground. Because here's the brutal truth. Once a nation realizes it doesn't need you, the power of your moral lectures, your sanctions, your offers of friendship, all of it evaporates. So when America calls India its indispensable partner, Indians smile politely, but behind closed doors they whisper, indispensable for whom? And that is the essence of the betrayal. That is why, despite all the summits, all the statements, all the photo ops, India will never look at America the same way again. The damage is already done. If you've been following along, you already know why India feels deeply betrayed by America. Why decades of hypocrisy, Cold War games, moral lectures, and public humiliation have broken the vase of trust. But here's the real question. What happens next? Because if part one was about the history of mistrust, part two is about the future of detachment. It's about why India will chart its own course, why America can no longer expect automatic loyalty, and why this shift will transform the balance of power across the globe. So let's dive in. When your relationship breaks down, you have two choices. Either rebuild it with total honesty, or walk away and redefine yourself without it. India today is leaning heavily toward the second option, not outright hostility, not a Cold War against Washington, but a slow, deliberate, irreversible distancing, a refusal to ever again be dependent. And here's the first sign, strategic autonomy. For decades, America has tried to pull India fully into its orbit, especially against China. Washington imagines a neat geopolitical picture, America and India shoulder to shoulder, leading the democratic world to contain Beijing. On paper, it sounds like a perfect marriage. But in reality, India sees the trap, because being America's frontline partner against China would mean sacrificing independence, becoming a pawn in someone else's game. And India has already lived through that once during the Cold War. Never again.
Look at the facts. India remains in the Quad. Yes. It joins military exercises with the US, yes. But at the very same time, India buys oil from Russia in defiance of American sanctions. It invests in Iran's Chabahar port, despite US displeasure. It maintains defense ties with Moscow, even upgrading fighter jets and missile systems. This isn't inconsistency. This is strategy. It's India saying loud and clear, we will cooperate when it suits us, but we will never be chained again.
Now let's turn to economics. America once believed it could lure India into permanent dependence through trade, tech, and capital. But India has flipped the script. Today, global corporations, Apple, Microsoft, Tesla, rush to India not because Washington tells them to, but because India itself has become indispensable as a market and as a manufacturing hub. A billion plus consumers, a rising middle class, a digital economy, exploding with opportunity, India knows its worth. And that means Washington's leverage has weakened. When India can buy oil in rupees, trade with the Gulf in its own terms, and attract European investment directly, America no longer holds the economic leash. But perhaps the most decisive shift is psychological. Indians no longer look at America with wide-eyed admiration. Once upon a time, young Indians dreamed of the American dream, saw Washington as the shining city on a hill. Today, while many still study or work in the US, the mood has changed. There's a quiet recognition. America is no longer the unquestioned leader it once was. Its internal divisions, its hypocrisy in foreign policy, its declining moral authority, all of this makes it less credible. Meanwhile, India's self-confidence has surged. From space missions to digital payments, from infrastructure growth to global diplomacy, India doesn't see itself as a junior partner anymore. It sees itself as an emerging pole of power. And when confidence meets betrayal, the result is distance. Let me give you a simple image. Imagine two roads. One road is America's road. Still powerful, but full of potholes, increasingly uncertain, and always demanding that companions march to its tune. The other road is India's road, unpredictable, yes, but self-directed, leading toward independence. India has chosen the second road. And once you choose that road, there's no turning back. Now let's talk about the